Have you ever wondered what happens when human genetics, left to its own devices in complete isolation, begins to fold in on itself? What remains after 7 generations of human beings marrying only within their own family circle? The answer lies in some of the most haunting chapters of human history. Tales of royal dynasties with faces so deformed they could barely speak. Of isolated island communities where colorblindness became the norm. Of mountain villages where children were born with fingers and toes fused together. This is the story of what happens when the human gene pool becomes not a pond, but a puddle, and how the consequences of such isolation echo through generations. Consanguinity, the practice of marrying close relatives, has been part of human history for millennia. From ancient Egyptian pharaohs who married their sisters to maintain divine bloodlines, to European royalty who believed that marrying cousins would keep power within the family, humans have repeatedly experimented with keeping genetics within tight circles. What they couldn't have known was the invisible price they would pay. The science behind this is both simple and terrifying. Each of us carries approximately 20,000 genes, and among them are a handful of recessive genes that could cause diseases or deformities. When unrelated people have children, the chance of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives reproduce, that probability skyrockets. With each generation of consanguineous marriage, the genetic dice roll becomes increasingly loaded. But what happens after not just 1 or 2 generations, but 7? Geneticists tell us that by the 7th generation of continuous inbreeding, the genetic diversity within a bloodline becomes so critically low that the chances of expressing harmful recessive genes increase exponentially. The human body, in essence, begins to turn against itself. Throughout history, several remarkable case studies illustrate this phenomenon in chilling detail. The most famous is perhaps the House of Habsburg, whose distinctive jaw became so pronounced through generations of uncle-niece and first-cousin marriages that by the 17th century, the last Habsburg king of Spain could barely chew his food. His tongue was so large he could barely speak, and his entire family line died out with him, a genetic dead end. Then there are the isolated communities, cut off from the world by geography or circumstance. On the tiny Pacific atoll of Pingelap, a devastating typhoon in 1775 reduced the population to just 20 survivors. One of them carried a rare gene for complete color blindness. Today, due to generations of isolation, nearly 10% of the island's population sees the world in black and white. In the remote valleys of Appalachia, communities cut off from mainstream society developed their own genetic legacy, a condition known as Blue Fugate family syndrome, where intermarriage caused a rare blood disorder that turned people's skin blue. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, a community known as the wolf children suffered from hypertrichosis, causing excessive hair growth over their faces and bodies, a trait passed down through generations of isolation. These are not just medical curiosities. They are human stories, stories of love, power, isolation, and survival. They remind us of the delicate genetic balance that makes us who we are and what happens when that balance is disrupted. As we journey through these remarkable cases, we'll explore not just the physical manifestations of genetic isolation, but the human cost as well. We'll meet the people behind these conditions, understand the cultural and historical forces that led to such isolation, and discover what modern science has learned from these natural experiments. What remains after 7 isolated generations? Sometimes, it's a distinctive physical feature that becomes a family trademark. Other times, it's a debilitating disease that extinguishes a bloodline entirely. Always, it's a testament to the incredible complexity of human genetics, and a warning about what happens when we forget that our strength lies in our diversity. Imagine a jaw so massive it distorts your entire face, making speech a struggle and eating a painful ordeal. Imagine being born into a family where this trait isn't rare, but expected, a royal signature etched onto the bones of every generation. This was the reality of the House of Habsburg, Europe's most powerful dynasty for centuries, whose relentless pursuit of power through consanguineous marriage ultimately sculpted their bodies as much as their empire. Their story is perhaps the most dramatic and well-documented case of what happens when genetic isolation becomes a political strategy. The Habsburgs didn't just occasionally marry cousins. They turned inbreeding into an art form, a cornerstone of their imperial policy. From the 15th century onwards, their strategy was clear: keep power, land, and pure royal blood within the family by marrying only close relatives. Uncle-niece unions were common. First cousins married frequently. Second cousins were practically strangers in their world. Their intricate family tree looks less like a branching oak and more like a tangled vine, looping back on itself with dizzying frequency. Why would they do this? The motivations were a potent mix of political pragmatism and dangerous hubris. Marrying within the family prevented valuable territories and titles from passing to outsiders. It cemented alliances internally, and perhaps most dangerously, it fostered a belief in the inherent superiority of their divine bloodline, a purity they felt must be preserved at all costs. They saw themselves as above the normal rules of biology, chosen by God to rule. The irony, of course, is that their very strategy to preserve their power became the instrument of its destruction. The physical manifestation of this genetic gamble became known as the Habsburg Jaw, or medically mandibular prognathism. It wasn't just a slight prominence, it was a severe underbite where the lower jaw jutted far beyond the upper, often accompanied by a thick, everted lower lip, Habsburg lip, and a large, misshapen tongue. Early portraits show the trait subtly present in Maximilian Fürst, 1459 to 1519. By the time of Charles V, 1500 to 1558, it was pronounced. With each successive generation of inbreeding, the deformity intensified, becoming grotesque. The most tragic and extreme example is Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700, the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish Empire. His pedigree is a staggering testament to consanguinity. His inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how related his parents were, was a shocking 0.254, equivalent to being born to a parent-child or full sibling union. This wasn't just bad luck. It was the predictable culmination of generations of strategic inbreeding. Charles II was, genetically speaking, more inbred than the child of siblings born to unrelated parents. His appearance was haunting. The Habsburg jaw was so severe he couldn't chew properly. His tongue was so large it constantly protruded, making his speech nearly unintelligible. He suffered from frequent seizures, severe intellectual disability, reportedly unable to read or write until adulthood, and a host of other ailments: rickets, intestinal problems, and possible pituitary gland dysfunction causing stunted growth and impotence. Contemporary accounts describe him as short, frail, mentally vacant, and physically repulsive. He was called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because his condition seemed beyond natural explanation. But Charles II wasn't just a medical curiosity. He was a king whose physical and mental incapacity paralyzed a global empire. His inability to govern effectively led to constant court intrigue, mismanagement, and the decline of Spanish power. His childlessness, widely attributed to his severe genetic disorders, meant the dynasty ended with him. His death in 1700, aged just 38, triggered the brutal War of the Spanish Succession, as Europe's other powers fought over the corpse of the Habsburg Empire he left behind. The genetic dead end had profound geopolitical consequences. Modern genetic analysis confirms what history already suspected. A 2009 study published in PLOS One analyzed the Habsburg pedigree and found a clear correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the severity of the mandibular prognathism. They identified the specific genetic regions likely responsible, recessive alleles that became homozygous, expressed due to the constant intermarriage. The study concluded that the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line was a clear example of the adverse effects of inbreeding. The Habsburgs serve as a stark, almost archetypal warning. Their story demonstrates how the relentless pursuit of genetic purity and power consolidation within a closed loop can have devastating, multi-generational consequences. It wasn't just one bad marriage. It was the cumulative effect of 7 generations of systematic inbreeding, each layer amplifying the genetic flaws of the last. The jaw that became their symbol of divine right became the visible mark of their biological decay. What remained after 7 generations? A king too deformed to rule, an empire plunged into chaos, and a bloodline extinguished by its own hand. The Habsburg Jaw wasn't just a facial feature. It was the grim signature of genetic isolation written across the face of history. Yet the Habsburgs were far from Rome alone. Across the globe, in communities isolated not by choice but by circumstance, similar genetic dramas were unfolding, often with equally profound, if less politically earth-shattering results. Imagine a world where the vibrant blues of the ocean, the lush greens of the jungle, and the fiery reds of a sunset all dissolve into shades of gray, where the concept of color is abstract, understood only through stories and the labels others give. This isn't a dystopian fantasy. It's the daily reality for nearly 1 in 10 people on the tiny Pacific atoll of Pingelap. Their story isn't about royal ambition or political strategy, but about the capricious cruelty of nature and the profound, unexpected legacy of survival against impossible odds. It's a stark reminder that genetic isolation isn't always chosen. Sometimes, it's forced by catastrophe, leaving its mark not on a dynasty, but on an entire community. Pingelap, part of Micronesia, seems idyllic, a speck of land surrounded by the vast turquoise expanse of the Pacific. But its tranquility masks a history etched in disaster. Around 1775, a catastrophic typhoon, known locally as Saikawa, the wave that eats people, slammed into the atoll. The storm surge was monstrous, scouring the island bare. When the waters receded, only a handful of survivors remained. Estimates range from as few as 5 to perhaps 20 individuals clinging to life amidst the devastation. Among them was a man remembered in oral tradition as King Mwahuele. Crucially, King Mwahuele carried a rare, recessive gene for a condition called complete achromatopsia, total colorblindness. This event, a brutal genetic bottleneck, reshaped Pingelap's future. With the population reduced to a tiny group of survivors, repopulation had to occur within this extremely limited gene pool. King Mwahuele, likely a respected leader, passed his genes to the next generation. As the community rebuilt, intermarriage among the descendants of the survivors wasn't just common, it was inevitable. There simply weren't enough unrelated people to go around. The stag. He was set for a dramatic demonstration of the founder effect and genetic drift. Achromatopsia itself is a rare condition globally, affecting roughly 1 in 30,000 people. It causes not only the absence of color vision, seeing the world only in grayscale, but also severe sensitivity to light, photophobia, reduced visual acuity, often 20/200 or worse, legally blind, and involuntary eye movements, nystagmus. In most populations, the gene remains rare because carriers, heterozygotes, rarely meet and have children with other carriers. But on Pingelap, the odds were stacked tragically high. The gene, introduced by King Mwahuele, became concentrated within the tiny, isolated population. By the late 20th century, when neurologist Oliver Sacks visited and documented the community in his book, The Island of the Colorblind, the prevalence was staggering. Approximately 10% of Pingelap's population had the condition. That's a rate thousands of times higher than the global average. Another 30% were silent carriers. The math is brutal. With such a small founding group and generations of necessary intermarriage, the chances of 2 carriers having children, and thus producing homozygous offspring with the condition, became incredibly high. 7 generations after the typhoon, the genetic legacy of one survivor was written in the grayscale vision of hundreds. Unlike the Habsburg Jaw, which was a visible mark of decay and power, achromatopsia on Pingelap became woven into the fabric of daily life. It wasn't a symbol of divine right, but a shared, often challenging, human experience. Those with the condition, known locally as Macallan, not seeing, developed remarkable adaptations. They learned to navigate the island by recognizing subtle differences in texture and brightness rather than color. They became acutely aware of the position of the sun, the patterns of waves, and the feel of the wind. In the blinding equatorial sunlight, many wore wide-brimmed hats or stayed indoors during the brightest parts of the day, their world literally shaded in gray. The community didn't ostracize them, they integrated them. Tasks requiring color vision, like distinguishing ripe fruit, were often handled by those with normal sight, while Macallan excelled in other areas, like fishing at dawn or dusk, when light was low and their grayscale vision was less disadvantaged. It became a normalized part of Pingelap's identity, a unique characteristic born from shared trauma and isolation. Children with achromatopsia weren't seen as cursed, but as part of the natural variation of the community. Modern genetic studies have pinpointed the exact mutation on chromosome 8 responsible for Pingelap's achromatopsia, confirming the founder effect. The story serves as a powerful natural experiment in human population genetics. It demonstrates how a single catastrophic event, reducing genetic diversity to a critical low, can amplify a rare recessive trait to astonishing levels within just a few generations. It wasn't deliberate inbreeding like the Habsburgs. It was the unavoidable consequence of survival and isolation. What remains after 7 isolated generations on Pingelap? Not a dynasty extinguished, but a community forever altered. A place where the world is perceived differently by a significant portion of its people, where the legacy of a typhoon and one man's genes is etched into the very way many see reality. It's a testament to human resilience and adaptation, but also a poignant illustration of the fragility of genetic diversity. The mask of the sea that isolated Pingelap also trapped its people within a genetic puddle, turning a rare disorder into a common heritage. Yet, unlike the Habsburgs, the Pingelapese story isn't one of collapse, but of endurance, finding ways to thrive even when the world, quite literally, lost its color. But Pingelap wasn't the only isolated community where geography and necessity conspired to create unique, genetic legacies. Far from the Pacific, nestled in the rugged mountains of eastern Kentucky, another family's story unfolded, marked not by color blindness, but by skin the shocking shade of indigo blue. Picture this: deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachian Kentucky, early 20th century. A family emerges from their cabin, their faces and hands the startling, impossible shade of deep indigo blue. Not a trick of the light, not paint, but their very skin. They weren't aliens, nor victims of industrial poisoning. They were the Fugates, a family whose unique genetic legacy, forged by isolation and necessity, turned them into living legends and subjects of horrified fascination. Their story is a stark reminder that genetic isolation isn't always about royal decrees or Pacific atolls. Sometimes it's born from the rugged, isolating embrace of mountains and poverty. The Fugate saga begins around 1820, when a French orphan named Martin Fugate arrived in Troublesome Creek, a remote area of Perry County, Kentucky. He brought with him little beyond the clothes on his back and, unbeknownst to him, a rare recessive gene. Martin married Elizabeth Smith, a local woman who, by sheer chance, also carried this same recessive mutation. The odds of 2 unrelated people in a larger population both carrying this specific gene were astronomically low. But in the isolated, sparsely populated hollows of Appalachia, chance encounters between carriers became far more likely. Their union set the stage for a genetic anomaly that would echo through generations. The condition that manifested in their descendants is called methemoglobinemia. Normally, hemoglobin in our red blood cells carries oxygen efficiently. Methemoglobinemia occurs when an enzyme deficiency, usually cytochrome B5 reductase, causes iron in the hemoglobin to change form. This altered hemoglobin, methemoglobin, cannot bind oxygen effectively. Instead of the rich, oxygenated red that gives blood its color, it turns a dark chocolate brown. When this brown blood circulates close to the skin, especially in lighter-skinned individuals, it imparts a startling blue, purple, or slate-gray tint to the skin, lips, and nail beds. Martin and Elizabeth Fugate had 7 children. 4 of them were reported to be blue. As the family grew and intermarried within the tiny isolated community, cousins marrying cousins was common due to limited choices and the difficulty of travel. The recessive gene became concentrated. The Fugates were a large, respected family, known for their hard work and resilience. But their blue skin set them apart. They became known locally as the Blue Fugates, or Blue People of Troublesome Creek. Life for the Blue Fugates was marked by more than just their unusual appearance. While the condition itself wasn't typically painful or life-threatening, though severe cases could cause fatigue, shortness of breath, and cyanosis, the social stigma was profound. They were often shunned, feared, or treated as objects of morbid curiosity. Children were mocked relentlessly. Adults faced discrimination and isolation. The blue skin became a mark of otherness in a community already defined by its separateness from mainstream America. They retreated further into the hollows, intermarrying even more within their own kin and a few neighboring families who also carried the gene, inadvertently amplifying the trait. The most famous and extensively documented Blue Fugate was Luna Fugate, 1886 to 1960. Described as strikingly beautiful despite her condition, Luna's skin was said to be the deepest, most vivid blue of any of her relatives. She married John Stacy, a man with normal skin color, and they had 13 children. Remarkably, some of their children were blue, some were not, perfectly demonstrating the recessive inheritance pattern. Luna lived a long life, bearing children, working the land, and becoming a local figure whose blue skin was both a source of shame and a point of grim fascination. Photographs of her, taken later in life, show a woman with a serene expression, her skin an undeniable deep blue. The mystery of the Blue Fugates persisted for over a century, dismissed by outsiders as myth or attributed to environmental causes like contaminated well water or mineral deficiencies. It wasn't until the 1960s that science finally caught up with the legend. Dr. Madison Cowain III, a hematologist from the University of Kentucky, heard the stories and became determined to solve the puzzle. He tracked down the Fugate descendants still living in the hills. Cowain recognized the symptoms immediately as methemoglobinemia. He tested their blood, confirming the high levels of methemoglobin. Crucially, he knew of a simple, effective treatment: methylene blue. This dye, when injected, acts as an electron donor, helping the faulty enzyme convert methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin. The results were dramatic and almost instantaneous. For the first time in their lives, members of the Fugate family saw their skin turn a normal, healthy pink. The treatment wasn't a permanent cure. The enzyme deficiency remained, requiring periodic doses, but it offered liberation from the visible stigma. Cowain's work, published in 1982 with a colleague, finally provided the scientific explanation. Genetic analysis confirmed the specific mutation responsible and traced its lineage back to Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith. The study highlighted the powerful role of the founder effect and genetic drift in this isolated Appalachian population. The combination of a rare recessive gene arriving with a founder, limited population size, geographic isolation, and cultural patterns of endogamy marrying within the group created the perfect storm for the trait to persist and express itself over generations. What remains after 7 isolated generations in Troublesome Creek? Not a vanished dynasty or a colorblind population, but a faded genetic ghost. The blue skin has largely disappeared from the Fugate lineage. As roads improved, the region opened up, and marriage outside the immediate community became commonplace. The gene pool expanded. The recessive gene is likely still carried silently by some descendants, but it rarely finds another carrier to manifest. The stigma has faded with the color. Yet, the story endures. a haunting Appalachian folktale proven true, a testament to the strange paths genetics can take when human communities become islands unto themselves. The Fugates' blue skin was a visible mark of isolation, a biological quirk amplified by poverty and geography, finally explained but never forgotten. Their story, like the Habsburg Jaw and Pingelap's Grayscale world, underscores a fundamental truth. Our genetic diversity is not just a biological fact. It's a buffer against the strange and often cruel twists that isolation can bring. But what broader lessons do these isolated genetic experiments hold for humanity as a whole? What do they reveal about our past, our present, and our potential future? What echoes through 7 generations of isolation? A jaw that couldn't chew, eyes that couldn't see color, skin that couldn't blush. But beyond these startling physical markers lies a deeper, more universal story written in our very DNA. A story about the fragile balance between unity and diversity, survival and stagnation. The Habsburgs, the Pingelapes, the Fugates. These are not just historical curiosities or medical footnotes. They are profound natural experiments, offering us a mirror to examine our own genetic past, present, and future. What remains after 7 isolated generations is more than deformity or adaptation. It's a stark lesson about the fundamental rules of life itself. The science behind these phenomena is both elegant and unforgiving. At its core lies the concept of genetic diversity. Think of a healthy population as a vast library containing millions of unique books, genes. When unrelated individuals reproduce, they randomly select books from different shelves to create a new, unique volume, their offspring. This constant reshuffling creates resilience. If one book contains a damaging typo, a harmful recessive mutation, it's unlikely another copy will be selected from a different shelf. The harmful trait remains hidden, unexpressed. Now, imagine isolating a small group and forcing them to reproduce only within that group. The library shrinks dramatically. Suddenly, the chances of selecting the same damaged book from both parents skyrocket. Harmful recessive mutations, once rare and safely hidden, become homozygous. They find their match and express themselves with devastating clarity. This is inbreeding depression, the reduction in biological fitness due to increased homozygosity. It manifests as lower fertility, higher infant mortality, weakened immune systems, and the physical deformities we've witnessed. The Habsburgs didn't just get unlucky. With Charles II. His tragic condition was the statistically predictable outcome of generations of systematically shrinking their genetic library. But isolation doesn't just amplify existing flaws. It can also magnify rare, neutral, or even mildly beneficial traits through genetic drift and the founder effect. Genetic drift is the random change in gene frequency in a small population. By pure chance, a rare gene carried by a founder, like King Mwahuele's colorblindness gene or Martin Fugate's methemoglobinemia gene, can become disproportionately common simply because the survivors carrying it happen to reproduce more. Over generations, this random sampling error can fixate a trait in the population, regardless of its adaptive value. Pingelap's 10% color blindness rate isn't advantageous. It's the stochastic legacy of a typhoon and 20 survivors. The Fugates' blue skin wasn't selected for. It was the random roll of the dice in a tiny, isolated gene pool. These historical cases serve as powerful cautionary tales about the perils of closed systems. The Habsburgs consciously chose a closed system for political power, believing their divine bloodline was superior. Their dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own genetic contradictions. The Pingelapes and Fugates were thrust into closed systems by geography and catastrophe. They adapted remarkably well culturally, but paid a heavy biological price. Their stories underscore that genetic isolation, whether chosen or forced, is inherently risky. It reduces the population's ability to adapt to new challenges, be it a novel disease, a changing climate, or simply the accumulation of genetic errors over time. Diversity isn't just a social ideal, it's an evolutionary imperative. Yet these isolated communities also offer unexpected insights into human resilience and adaptation. The Pingelapese didn't let colorblindness destroy their society. They built intricate systems of support and adaptation around it. The Fugates, despite stigma and hardship, persevered for generations, their blue skin becoming a strange, accepted part of their mountain identity. These stories reveal the incredible capacity of human culture to buffer biological limitations. They show that while genetics sets boundaries, human ingenuity, social structures, and sheer will can expand the possibilities within those boundaries. The "what remains" isn't just deformity, it's also testament to the enduring strength of family and community bonds forged in isolation. Crucially, the lessons of these historical isolates resonate powerfully in our modern interconnected world. While global travel has drastically reduced geographic isolation, other forms persist and even emerge. 1. Cultural and religious isolation. Communities like the Amish or certain fundamentalist groups practice high levels of endogamy, marrying within the group to preserve cultural and religious traditions. While not as extreme as 7 generations of close-kin marriage, this isolation increases the risk of specific genetic disorders becoming more prevalent. For example, Ellis Van Creveld syndrome, a form of dwarfism with heart defects, is significantly more common among the Old Order Amish due to founder effects and intermarriage. Modern genetic counseling within these communities is crucial for managing these risks. L2. Socioeconomic isolation. Poverty and lack of access to education and healthcare can create de facto genetic isolation, limiting marriage choices within disadvantaged communities, potentially concentrating harmful recessive traits. 3. Conservation biology. The principles observed in olates are directly applicable to endangered species. Small, fragmented animal populations suffer from the same problems: inbreeding depression, loss of genetic diversity, and accumulation of harmful mutations. Conservationists actively manage breeding programs, facilitate migration between populations, and even use genetic rescue, introducing unrelated individuals, to mimic the benefits of outcrossing, precisely because they understand the lessons written in the Habsburg Jaw and the Fugate skin. 4. Personalized medicine and genealogy. The rise of direct-to-consumer genetic testing has made people acutely aware of their own ancestry and potential carrier status for recessive disorders. Understanding one's genetic heritage, including potential founder effects from past migrations or isolations, empowers informed family planning decisions. So, what truly remains after 7 isolated generations? A profound warning and a vital lesson. The warning is clear: genetic isolation, whether driven by power, geography, or circumstance, extracts a heavy toll. It erodes the very foundation of adaptability and health, leading to deformity, disease, and ultimately, extinction. The Habsburgs are the ultimate symbol of this. Their pursuit of purity led only to decay and disappearance. The lesson is equally vital. Our strength lies in our diversity. Genetic diversity is the raw material for evolution, the shield against disease, the engine of adaptation. It is the legacy of countless generations of our ancestors who migrated, mixed, and connected across continents. The stories of the Habsburgs, Pingelap, and Troublesome Creek are not just about the past. They are a lens through which to view our future. In an era where technology allows unprecedented manipulation of genetics and where social forces can still create divisions, understanding the consequences of isolation is more critical than ever. They remind us that we are all part of a vast, interconnected genetic library, constantly rewritten and enriched by new connections. To close ourselves off, genetically, culturally, or intellectually, is to risk becoming a stagnant puddle, vulnerable to every random storm. What remains after 7 isolated generations is the undeniable proof that life, in all its resilience and beauty, thrives not in isolation, but in the vibrant, messy, and endlessly creative tapestry of diversity. The ultimate legacy of these isolated families is not their deformity, but the clarion call they echo through time: connect, mix, and endure.